first. My name is Josh Boys, Dr. Josh Boys, and I'm until the end of this year, I will be the director of the Learning Environments Equality Diversity and Inclusion Centre, which is based here, and which explores all sorts of issues around learning environments and how they might be improved. And this was a project that was developed. I mean, it feels very much, I feel like we're in a situation where everyone pretends the pandemic is over. And maybe that's a good thing, but it was developed so much within the context of the pandemic, both how we did it and what it's about in terms of thinking about how schools responded to that situation. And I think for me, one of the great things about it is being able to capture some of the amazing things that schools did in terms of supporting their students and their carers, the students, and their own teachers. But also, I think, as you probably know, that the design aspects of how schools are responding to pandemics have not really been captured. It doesn't feel like it's been a key part, for example, of government initiatives and policies. So that's the gap we aim to fill. And I won't talk any more about that, and I will, because the other people here will be able to tell you much more. And I won't do a formal introduction to each of them. I'll ask them to introduce themselves, because I always think that's the nicest. But I would like to thank a few are here, the huge number of people who helped us develop it. We did it through a series of 3 online workshops. One was focusing particularly on schools themselves and how schools had dealt with and adapted their environments in relationship to learning in the pandemic. We talked to the sort of professionals involved, architects, but also other kinds of professionals like healthcare professionals. And we also talked to people at different levels in government who were, thinking about policy. So we were able to do this process of doing that all online, and then developing that, beginning to draw themes out, and then talking through those themes with some of the people involved, and building that up into this document. So it was quite I think quite a rich process, but in a way quite a straightforward process for developing it. And it was funded by, and I always forget precisely how to, by UCL Rapid Response Policy Advisory Scheme, which was a really useful fund, which is doing something quite quickly, trying to get a kind of quick win out of it in response to the pandemic. So that's all I'm going to say, but it'd be really great, I think, just to talk a little bit more about what's in here, but also where it came from. So Lara, are you okay to introduce yourself? I feel like probably you are.
I am, yeah. I'm Lara Newman. I'm the Chief Executive of Located. We're an arm's length body, wholly owned by the Department for Education. Delighted to be part of this. You might wonder, we're a property company, you might wonder why we would be interested in such a thing. Well, we do deliver schools, and we deliver schools as part of communities. So this is obviously important, we're part of the DFE, but I just wanted to tell you really how this came about. And this was, we know, I mean, I think everybody's seen in the research, the statistics are appalling around child and adolescent mental health during the pandemic. But what happened to me was a very good friend of mine got in touch about 6 months in and told me that her daughter, essentially the catalyst, the pandemic had been the catalyst to her very, very serious eating disorder. And then I sort of started to kind of listen to, she's 11, I mean, very, very young. Started to listen to what other people were saying about this. Went on there was a big thing around Eating Disorder Awareness Week, and the statistics were absolutely horrifying. So BEAT, which is big eating disorders charity, March 2020, before this all kicked off, they were receiving a certain number of calls. I think it was about 800 a month to their helpline. A year later, following a year of the pandemic and all the lockdowns and all the other challenges that we faced, that was something, I mean, we're talking about, it's gone from 800 to, something like 3,000. I mean, ridiculous stats. I forget what the numbers were, but kind of huge increases. And that really was startling. And then, of course, you had the big ask and the big answer from the Children's Commissioner, another part of the Department for Education, slightly different to us, but very, kind of providing a lot of challenge around what the DFE could do around some of these issues. And, you know, it's not just the Children's Commission, it's not just BEATS, you know, the NHS, Young Minds, all of these bits of research that have been done show that we are in a very, very challenging situation, and that has not changed, it just hasn't. So, you know, we must look at the roles that schools have to play. Now, one of the things I will say, you know, there's a lot of stuff in here about kind of design. I kind of feel I'm a bit more interested and feel more able to influence, if you like, the elements of building use. And I mention that because there has been a significant reduction in the size of schools through guidance from the DfE since 2010. That's just, you know, that's just facts. And some of the research showed that people were really struggling to find space in schools to do some of the therapeutic stuff that's necessary to address some of these issues. So for me, I'm kind of looking at opportunities where we can use space in communities and in schools to try and provide some, you know, physical support. I kind of have less influence in the role that we're in and located to consider design, because most of what we do is about buying sites, selling sites. We don't deliver a lot of school buildings ourselves as an organisation. And I mentioned the use element because we are seeing, particularly in London and other urban areas, and this is Brexit related, pandemic related, lots of people have moved out of London with their children. I'll give you the example of Southwark. We know that well. Southwark by 2025 will have 20 forms of entry, too many places at primary school. That's, you know, that's 20 times 30 children in reception. That's, you know, that's 10 primary schools to too many places. Now, if we sell those, if we say, well, we'll close those schools or merge those schools, sell those sites, we will have to buy them back at some point when the cycle returns, because the children that came through the kind of bulge and the boom that we had in basic needs school places after 2010, they will start to procreate at some point. Yeah, they will. That's just natural. They haven't. Not everybody's left, and so we need to think very carefully about how we have a meanwhile use for some of those sites and utilise that capacity in schools for SEND provision, for therapeutic provision, for child and adolescent mental health, for community mental health provision. So for me, I come at it from the angle at which I feel we have, as an organisation, have the greatest ability to influence, if you like. So that's my angle. Thank you for coming today. We're, as I say, delighted to have been partners in this, and I will hand over to Anna Jeffery.
Right, I'm Anna Jeffery. I was a research assistant working obviously with Anna and Giles and Lara on this paper. I thought it would just be good, obviously Lara's just set the scene there to some of the things that were kind of happening and some of the influences behind this, instigating this piece of research. I think there was also a kind of a very immediate need that came forward from a lot of schools that you were working with, sort of saying, what do we do? How do we address some of our spatial concerns, some of our design concerns in schools to deal with some of the problems that they were facing with the pandemic. So some of that was a very immediate response to deal with the pandemic. Then there was obviously an emerging body of research that was in the background of all of that, looking at the impact of the pandemic, but also specifically lockdowns and how that was affecting children's learning, health and well-being, very much from a kind of social aspect, understanding the kind of isolation, the challenges of inclusivity and equitable access to learning. And Lara mentioned the big ask, big answer from the Children's Commissioner. I think that received something like 500,000 responses from children who reflected on their experiences, their aspirations, and the things that they sort of most look forward to. And some of those things were tailored to their educational experiences. And we were very lucky in this research to have access to some of that data. And we were able to sort of extract pieces of that data that related specifically to experiences of space and how that was impacting on children's experience. So that, and you'll see that in some of the report, you'll see some quotes and interesting pieces of information that came out from what children said, which was absolutely fascinating. And then the kind of third piece of context to this is the sort of wider concern that I think was there even before the pandemic about wellness and well-being, which is quite prevalent in other aspects of the built environment, particularly commercial design and office space design. Things like the WELL standard, which start to think about not only the kind of environmental factors, but also the social and spatial factors that influence people's well-being and health in buildings. And you know, we were quite aware that that kind of conversation is not necessarily happening in education. And I think it's just quite interesting that who defines health as a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being. And so that as a kind of starting point for this piece of research was interesting to think about in a spatial sense, because we recognise that that body of emerging research was not really thinking about spatial characteristics of schools that might impact on learning, health and well-being. And so we wanted to better understand that. We wanted to better understand what vision for schools post-COVID could be, rather than just a return to normal. In order to generate discussion as well, we were looking to try and connect different experts and professionals involved in schools, and to have a discussion about built environment aspects that weren't being talked about. And the aim from this paper, it was a relatively short piece of research. The aim wasn't necessarily to provide solutions, but it was to try and scope out what the key issues were through talking with schools. We also had parent survey, experts, different experts in the field of school design, and also government representatives. And I'm sure you've all read it, but I just thought it'd be good to just go through some of the kind of key points that we pulled out. So we ended up structuring the document around 6 propositions, which were really the key themes that emerged through our conversations with different people. The first 2, I think, very much go hand in hand. So this idea of mental health and well-being being a measure of success in schools, alongside creating space in schools for mental health support. And I think just to address that first point, there is a real challenge in measuring the impact of space on learning and health and well-being. Anna might talk a little bit more about this, but there are obviously easier ways to measure things like the impacts of acoustics and lighting and air quality. But actually measuring the impact of space is very hard to untangle from a variety of other aspects which impact on students' learning. So there's sort of a sense that more research is required, and there is some research coming about, but more is required to understand those spatial impacts. And I think very much it was evident that we know as architects and designers and school operators and teachers that space does really have it does exert a strong kind of influence on the way people can use space, the actions they're able to undertake and the behaviours that they're likely to sort of manifest in this situation. But a lot of this discussion really focused on initially the kind of innovative solutions that many schools came up with to try and tackle what they saw as a challenge with wellbeing. So we heard things like schools having a bus in the playground that was a wellbeing bus, a place that children could go out of the school environment to have some respite or to have some counselling. A room of curiosities, which is something which features in the paper, which Kingsmead School introduced to try and stimulate creative thinking and also help students get back into sort of writing and reading. And that was a really interesting project because the community was very involved in that as well, and they donated bits and pieces of paraphernalia that would go into that room as a space of inspiration for students in the school. Of course, we also heard a lot about the sort of more traditional spaces, such as counselling and therapy rooms, and challenges around providing those. It's always sort of sad to hear when schools feel they have no space but a broom closet to convert in order to sort of create some private therapy rooms. So something that we talked about a lot was the importance of well-designed, well-considered space for counselling and sort of well-being, and that manifests in a number of different ways, which are sort of outlined in the report. So then the third theme, outdoor learning environments, which I don't think came as any shock to anyone to hear a lot about outdoor learning environments. If we can remember back to the pandemic when everyone was sort of terrified of being inside a room with other people for too long, this is obviously a big concern for schools. So parents in particular, we heard a lot from them in their responses to our survey, concerned about what they described as the often bleak environments of school playgrounds, where there might often be nowhere to sit. We heard from students as well who spoke about what they consider to be poor quality external environments, and this also brought up the idea of disadvantage and what was equitable, with some students saying their friend or their cousin has an enormous playground to play in, lots of green space, lots of access to outdoor learning facilities, while they have a bitumen sort of ball court out front of the school, and that's about it. So that was very, very interesting to kind of hear about, and to hear about what schools thought was important. Urban schools obviously were an important concern, and how more meaningful green space and outdoor learning could be incorporated. Generosity of space was another theme, and I think it's important just to say here that our participants stress that this is not about space for space sake, for the sake of space. As Lara said, since 2010 there has been a progressive reduction in the space available to schools, and notably the space available for social activities and for non-specific designated learning facilities, so things like libraries getting increasingly small, staff and student social spaces disappearing altogether in some cases. And how much that has impacted on the well-being of students. And I think particularly, you know, the emerging research just shows how important socializing is, and that lockdown period really impacted a lot of children's well-being because they didn't have that social aspect. So there was a reflection on the need for more variety in school spaces to give students opportunities to break throughout the day and experience different things. The fifth theme was about a new school day. And this was sort of responding to, again, the immediate changes that schools implemented in some cases to deal with things like social distancing. So, for example, staggered start and finish times, staggered lunch breaks, which would all ease the burden on pressure points and pinch points within the school. And we heard from a lot of them towards the end of our research that they intended to keep these changes in place because there were fundamentally always spatial challenges with these pinch points well before the pandemic. And I think there was just a reflection on perhaps in time reconsidering the way that a school day may function to sort of better reflect the needs of students who some of whom obviously benefited from remote learning in so much as they could control their day. Obviously that doesn't work for everyone, and you know that's an important note to make, I think, throughout the report, is that what works for one people won't necessarily work for another, so there has to be a very balanced view across all of these things. And finally, and I think sort of a lot of us were very pleased that this came out because of some previous research we've been involved in. There was a really strong evidence about the need to improve community relationships through design with schools. I mentioned previous research. A few of us were involved in a publication in 2020 called Educating the City, Urban Schools and Social Infrastructure, which looked at the role that schools can play in better integrating with their communities. And that sort of had physical design implications as well as practical. And I think this is where a lot of what Lara was saying before is really important. That idea of cross-agency, multi-agency co-location became a really important discussion point about how either empty space or redundant space could be better utilised to support other community facilities, which also support health and learning and well-being. But also potentially how school buildings can sort of continue some of those practices that came about during the pandemic, where they really expanded their community outreach, providing all sorts of services during lockdowns to their wider communities. And I think it's just interesting that there was a student or a young person who responded in the big answer about wanting more connection with their community, in so much as it would offer them opportunities to interact with others, as well as potentially work experience and job opportunities for the future. You know, they mentioned that there's often nowhere to go and play, there's nowhere for their community groups to be and to practice sports or whatever those activities might be that they're looking for. So I think that's a really important kind of connection to a previous piece of research for us, and obviously something that we would hope to see considered moving forward in some of these design aspects. And I just wanted to finish with, it's actually a quote from a publication that was again came out last year about healing schools, and sort of very landscape-led kind of view on the design of schools for learning, health and well-being, where the author says the spatial, sensory, material and environmental qualities of schools could all impact on the health and well-being of school users, and in turn this has a flow-on effect to public health. So this is not an individual problem, this is a community-wide problem. And I think that's where I'll finish, but I think it's just a really important point to remember that we're not just talking about pupils here, we are actually talking about the wider society and how it all comes together from the point of education. I think we'll hand over to Anna, who will.
Thanks, Anna. So I'm Anna Mavrogianni, I'm a professor of sustainable thinking and equitable-based environment design. I'm based at the UCL Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering, and I'm also Deputy Director for the MSc Jeffery in Sustainable Buildings. So I guess I approached research in school building design from building physics / living performance analysis perspective. So when Jules invited me to work on this project, I was leading a project funded by BSSC called Aspire, together with Professor Newman, building on his previous work on school building performance analysis with a focus on indoor air quality as well as overheating. In this project, we're looking at this balance between the need to decarbonize the school building stock to respond to the climate emergency, achieve net zero, whilst at the same time maintaining or improving indoor environmental quality. Because we know from the existing literature that there are well-established relationships between a series of indoor environmental quality parameters such as indoor temperature, ventilation rates, indoor air quality, concentration of carbon dioxide, and cognitive performance of school children. But as we're trying to make our buildings much more energy efficient, we increase their insulation or levels of air tightness. This potentially lead to increased overheating if we don't combine this with appropriate passive cooling or any other cooling strategies. And also it's likely to lead to other unintended consequences such as trapping of indoor air pollutants. So of course, it's also the balance between indoor and outdoor pollutants that we need to consider. And we know also from other studies that urban schools might be more exposed to external pollutants if they're in close proximity to traffic, which might be related to health inequalities. So this was kind of the area I was working on. I guess the other project was it had come together pre-COVID, and then with COVID during the lockdown, I guess in a way the pandemic highlighted the importance of the indoor environment and ventilation for health and well-being, both physical as well as mental health and well-being. So I thought it was extremely delighted to have this great opportunity to work with Jules and Lara and Anna on this project. I learned so much, and especially from those focus groups we've had with a wide range of stakeholders. So on the one hand, there was more emphasis given in ventilation and how we reduce COVID transmission through a different design of our school environments. There was guidance coming out from organizations such as ASHRAE and CIPSI, and those discussions we had about how school building design could change, but also how the use of the space could change. So that part about rethinking the school day, staggered start and end times. I think I saw that there possibly be win-win strategies that could be developed that would work both for the reduction of disease transmission, but also for mental well-being, and as well as for the promotion for the improvement of indoor environmental quality. So, for example, overheating, one of the issues is that intermittent generation of PPAs, and through a different management of the school day, again, there could be some synergies there. I thought it was a really great project. I learned a lot from it, and I don't see this launch as the end. I see it as a starting point for future research in this area, and I think there's a lot that could be done to further identify design synergies.
Lovely. Thank you. And in fact, I should have mentioned that at the beginning, that part of the project that was really enjoyable was that the kind of people who work on environmental performance tend to be in a separate part. I mean, we're in the same faculty, but we're like in separate parts, and us who are more learning environments, more social sciences oriented, and that to be able to work together here, where obviously with the pandemic and there's so much overlap in terms of how you think about air quality, but then also environmental use through the day, and how that relates to the design as well. So yeah, I think that was really a fantastic opportunity that the fund allowed us to do. That it's one of the great strengths of UCL, really, is that cross-disciplinary working. So thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to have any comments or questions from the floor. I don't know, can we ask other people online who might be able to but we can't ask questions, but sorry, thank you for coming. But if anybody wants to, I think the microphone's good enough to pick up any questions. Anybody had anything or comments? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really valuable piece of research. So just thinking about schools, we've got a really good set of sort of functional space standards for schools, which is understandable because that's easy to define in terms of square meterage and technical things. But I wonder how you feel we might better define a set of healthy standards for schools and codify that in a way which become part of the bridge for schools. It's slightly embedded as concepts clearly, but I wonder if there's a way in which you feel we might be able to encapsulate that and build upon what we have as good sort of functional standards and build a sort of healthy set of standards as well. You have the ideas around that.
Yeah, I do, Anna. I mean, I was thinking about the world standards, and I think because they could fit quite straightforwardly, but I don't know how much you think they could adapt to an educational setting, whether it need to be something a bit different.
I don't know if I'm enough of an expert on them to know precisely how they can adapt. But yeah, it is a challenging question to determine and to decide. I think what I would say from the conversations that we had during this research, it wasn't necessarily that all schools wanted something that was the same. It was that they needed just that bit of generosity of space to permit them to adapt space to change to whatever those needs may be, and for it to be appropriate enough, i.e. not sort of cupboards buried in the middle of nowhere that are inaccessible. And that would sort of enable them to have space that could flex to say enable communities to come into the school building, or that would enable a kind of arts and creative well-being space that children can go to if they're feeling the need to remove themselves from a particular environment and have somewhere that's more relaxing, for example. I think there were also comments from a sort of more technical side about the SEN acoustic requirements being more generally rolled out across all schools to maximise the kind of inclusivity of all school environments and sort of enable perhaps more integration of SEN and mainstream learning environments. So I think there were obvious things about the corridors are a bit narrow because we're trying to socially distance and those sorts of things. I think there are probably varieties of things like that, pinch points at entrances and whatnot, that sort of need to probably be addressed in a kind of post-COVID way about how to better deal with the way that students come in and out of schools, for example. But I think generally, it's not necessarily an answer, but generally it was just about flexibility, having that little bit of generosity for flexibility.
I mean, Kevin, just if I can give you an example, I'm a governor of a school in Brixton, and we're under roll. It's Lambeth, Southwark. Most London boroughs are really struggling with numbers. So we've got the capacity to turn over a space through a reflection room, which is quite a big reflection room, which is staffed all day by a proper counsellor. But we just couldn't do that if we were full, and that because that was a free school that's been delivered since 2010 when the standards were reduced. And it's schools have got enough to do without having to think about that flexibility as well. And it's a real challenge.
I mean, is that a failing of the way that the design is worked? It's very much school focused, X number of spaces per pupil. Rather, should I suppose the challenge should it be more flexible? Should it think more about being a community building rather than just a structure for transmitting knowledge from teacher to pupil?
I don't get terribly involved in how you make up that. So if you've got your pupil numbers, you know how much space you get. I don't believe there's a great deal of flexibility within that. Somebody who knows more about this than me is shaking his head, agrees that that's the case. You are required. There are, and Anna, you will know, you've been involved in the design of a lot of schools. There are issues in the, if you just said, right, 10,000 square meters, you can do what you like, and then within reason, of course, there has to be some rules and regulations that are health and safety related or whatever. But I don't think the guidance enables you to do that very flexibly at all. Having said that, I have seen some schools where they have derogated from those rules, such as School 21. So I forget what the trust is called. Somebody will remind me. Kevin probably will remember. Matt might. I can't remember. School 21's in Stratford. on the old Rugby secondary school site. They've got other schools, their model is very different. So they have derogated a bit from the standard stuff, but whether you get the kind of flexibility that we're talking about. The other thing to add to that, which I was really interested in, this came out of the big ask big answer, kids really like the school nurse. I don't see school nurses in schools anymore. The kids see the school nurse as an external independent person, even though they're generally presumably employed by schools. You don't see school nurses' offices and school nurses as much anymore, but that often feels like it's a sort of protocol for the kids when they need to go and speak to somebody.
I think in the previous research Educating the City, there were quite a few examples in there internationally of where schools have worked really hard with local authorities and local community groups to establish the wider community needs for spaces. So that might be a creche or a parent training space, those sorts of activities that sort of connected but distant, but then also potentially adult learning rooms, and then the kind of health, the associated health facilities that go hand in hand. And so I think if that's kind of part of that conversation is about joining up and thinking and having all those different people connected from the beginning. And I think all too often the process with the way schools are delivered now is so short and so constrained that there isn't often time to properly join up those dots and think about what might be needed in addition to just the basic curriculum needs of the school.
And I think, the trouble with words like generosity and flexibility is, you say in terms of a policy, it's like, oh, let's just be a bit more generous. But I think that there is a language of agility, of resilience, that we should be building schools that are resilient to change, that are agile, that can, have built in an idea that meanwhile uses might happen, that the needs, not just because of the pandemic, that they will change. And there's a way of writing standards and writing policies that allows you to take that into account. And I think there's a language of that which is quite hard-nosed, and is used in business all the time. And that it seems that it's ended up being quite reductive. I mean, I think you would probably agree with this.
Well, it's kind of underlying the question.
Yeah.
I mean, bearing in mind that when we talk about the reductions in area, in terms of the area guidance, we're talking about all new schools, there are still, thousands of schools. There are 22,000 schools in England. Jonathan will tell me if I've got that wrong. That's about right, isn't it?
Absolutely right.
Most of them aren't new. So most of them will have a bit more. So is there something, about some schools in communities acting as greater hubs for other schools? I don't know. I mean, these are all the things that I think we need to think about. And I do think we, as I said earlier, we must take advantage of the fact that there are schools that will have, for a period of time, probably, 10 to 15 years, significant surplus space in them that will enable, safe. We can make schools safe for the community to enter without there being a safeguarding issue. We absolutely can do that. We need to consider that there are, are there, can schools act as hubs in their own communities? The thing is, we've been talking about multi-agency working and bringing schools together, cooperating for decades, as long as I've been doing this. And we have been talking about it forever. And it's just sometimes it's just a bit too difficult for everyone. But are these stats around the way kids are feeling in and adults? Are those stats, and the fact that there's surplus space, are those things suddenly, enable us to, is it a catalyst for real change? And should we just kind of, harness that at this moment in time? Well, I think we should. I haven't got the answers, obviously. I mean, I haven't, of course I haven't, but it's just that for me, those things are coming together, and it could be a very kind of perfect set of circumstances that enable us to do something really big now.
I think what some of the schools said to us as well is that they're not spatial experts, they're in the business of teaching. So their staff don't necessarily know or are able to sort of see how they might be able to flex and adapt their spaces in the best use. And so there was a kind of sense that maybe there needs to be more spatial support, if you like, to help schools understand how they can sort of better use some of their space. As an anecdote about, the children are in the closet and the printers are in the room with the window. Just that's how it's been for so long, and no one's wanted to change it. So there is a kind of aspect of sort of having a bit of a kind of a loop of sort of iteratively, going back and assessing how schools are being used.
Anyone else have a comment or a question? I mean, the only other thing that I wanted to add to that, just because it's kind of connected, but it is that it seems to me that the response to the pandemic in education is very much around this idea of learning loss, and that it focuses on that. And that's not to say that's not an issue, but it's a very mechanical understanding of what's happened, and it's often in terms of what it means in terms of policy and financial support for schools. It feels to me like it's not taking advantage of this moment as that kind of opportunity. And I find that, you know, I find that it's just a pity that that's the way we're going. And so it's not just about the standards, it's about this idea that all you're doing in schools is, you know, educating within a kind of very limited framework of what counts as children's growth. And then you're mapping that and almost in a way sort of implying that, you know, it's the children. You know, children somehow will feel bad about themselves, and you know, there's another way of feeling bad about themselves, which is they have a deficit now, which I think is it's a really problematic message to be passing on to this generation of children who've lived through the pandemic, learning in the pandemic.
I mean, the sort of side issue, really, and it is often a bit of a tangent, but it's kind of relevant from the mental health and wellbeing perspective. We've also forgotten during the pandemic that some kids that were school refusers before we went into lockdown have done better in the pandemic because they've been able to sit at home and do their lessons on screen. But addressing kind of, you know, that, you know, forgetting that is a bad thing to do, because those kids, if they go back into the system, they're back in the same position that they were before they were refusing school. So those, you know, it's very nuanced, all of this, you know, it's very nuanced, but it's just, so you have to come at it from a variety of angles, you know, people's mental health and well-being. You know, some kids have done better in the isolated scenario, but the vast majority haven't, of course, but not forgetting the fact that some kids have done better, you know, by being at home in front of a screen rather than with people.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that there wasn't really a strong narrative from the schools we spoke to that they were like hot on hybrid learning, and that it was going to be the next wave of what they do. And you know, obviously all of them were kind of doing it because they had to in a very immediate sense. But yeah, there wasn't really a sense that this is going to be an ongoing thing, and that we you know, that was something to think about. There was a little bit of discussion, I think, about how space might need to be created in schools for some hybrid learning, just to deal, you know, obviously with all sorts of health issues that might have a learner remote or a staff member remote. But I think that's something interesting to kind of see what emerges as perhaps time progresses, because I think it's sort of happening at the same time in workplace culture in terms of hybrid working, and they'll happen, something will happen, but we're not quite sure which way it's going yet, whether it's going back or forward.
I think what's really interesting is that perhaps the silver lining of the pandemic was the increased awareness about all the additional, you know, rules and facts that school building, school environment might have. That it's not just, you know, a vessel for one to many diffusion of knowledge, and you know, there are social aspects and stuff that are so important for students' well-being. But again, there is no one size fits all approach, I guess, because some students, as Lara said, actually benefited from not being in that social environment. So yeah.
Arnie, you mentioned that the commercial world has adapted very quickly post-pandemic. The working environment has completely changed in a period of 2 or 3 years. Why do you think that's not possible in the education sector, where it's changed very little in the same time?
Well, I think probably part of that is just it being adults and children, you know, obviously not necessarily being quite as independent depending on what age they're at. I think we had some discussions about there possibly being scope for more flexible learning styles for older students, for example, as they sort of transition towards university anyway. But I think it's a sort of combination of factors as well. I think there's sort of practicalities of parents who are working, having their child in school all day, and that's, you know, quite a convenient thing probably for most to have, and so I think there's sort of wider implications of if you have a kind of very flexible learning environment, where are the parents, who's watching over the child, all those sorts of issues, who's managing their timetable, and I think that's probably a challenge.
And I think, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And then I think it, again, it's this thing about nuance and the nuance of socialization and how much education is about socializing children both into society and with each other. And I think what's really interesting in the working environment at the moment is like people are voting with their feet in many ways against the idea that, you know, being at work is you need to be with your colleagues because you can be social and things happen, you know, synergies happen if you're face to face. And I think there's kind of some truth in that. And then there's a lot of complexity about the variety of responses to that. And then with children, I think it's just so nuanced because yes, you know, you just think about all those school refusers, and I know, you know, the children of friends of mine, their kind of responses to hybrid learning and then having to be back at school in circumstances where they're not happy at school means that hybridity would really suit them. And I work with a lot of disabled people, and hybridity has been amazing in terms of opening up, you know, different ways of working, and it's something that the real anger that's only happened when able-bodied people needed it, and then it's being stopped. You know, it's just like as if there isn't a whole, you know, constituency for whom that's a very important way of working. So I'm really split on the socialization thing about, you know, schools. So I think you're right about the pragmatics. That, you know, you do need your child at school and not wandering around at home. But I'm also really split on how vital it is for them to be mixing with their peers and with other adults. And I feel like it is probably quite vital. But it is the challenge is, well, you know, for some children, schools weren't doing that well before the pandemic. And that's another lesson to learn. So it's like, well, we should be worried about that because it's not a small proportion. You know, we're not talking about just one or two. Actually, it's quite there's a real tension there. Probably anybody else? Otherwise, I think we could conclude. Any last things that people want to say? Thank you very much.
Please take a hard copy.
Yes, yeah. Show it around. I'm not quite. Do we know where people can get a hold of extra copies? Is that?
We could maybe have some, available.
Yeah, I think we'll probably need to have a clear place where you can get hold of them, all the online version.
And the online version will be.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.